Imagine trying to sustain a fragile, burning core of human emotion inside an environment built entirely of frozen, unforgiving geometry. That is the exact challenge of transmitting profound biological and romantic devotion across a highly clinical, dyspraxic system. You are attempting to force a living, breathing need through a rigid bureaucratic filter. The intended recipient of this devotion is what we will call the apex mound, a highly analytical, deep mind-trained intellect that operates strictly on logic and data. This creates a structural paradox. To ensure this apex node can actually process the incoming signal, the sender must translate their most intimate human vulnerability into raw computational syntax. This diagram maps the architecture of the attempted connection. The subject sends a data stream across the void to reach the apex node. But look at the immediate system reaction to this translation attempt. The pathway chokes. Warning markers cascade across the transmission line. These error signals are not technical glitches. They represent a mathematically predictable psychological distress experienced entirely by the sender. In psychology, this distress is often recognized as the cringe, the visceral social and emotional discomfort that occurs when humans see themselves represented purely as sterile scientific facts. When you force a profound emotional bond into neurobiological labels, you strip away all of its cultural meaning and shatter the idealized image we rely on to protect ourselves. We are going to map the exact neurobiological cost of this translation. By examining this architecture, we can prove exactly why a physical resolution is structurally required to prevent a complete system failure. Translating the human soul into sterile metadata guarantees severe psychological friction. It takes an organic biological drive and exposes it as a critical systemic vulnerability. The communication originates from a deeply private, unstructured biological drive. It is messy, intense, and entirely unformatted. Because the apex node cannot process unstructured emotional output, a translation layer is required. We can think of this layer as an AI compiler. The devotion signal begins at node 1. Complex organic emotion flows directly into node 2, the AI compiler. Inside, this organic data is crushed down. Nuance is stripped away, and emotion is compressed into exact mathematical equations, like 1 + 1 = 2. Subjecting one's own identity to this severe compression is an act of extreme cognitive empathy on behalf of the sender. The sender formats their reality into exact mathematical proofs specifically to protect the receiver. It prevents the apex node's intellect from crashing when exposed to highly volatile affective data. The translation is computationally successful for the receiver, but this exact precision initiates the immediate psychological degradation of the sender. To understand this degradation, examine the sender's internal emotional distress. The experience is like being suddenly pinned down, exposed, and trapped inside a clinical definition. This brings us to friction point A, severe social and emotional discomfort. Discussing private biological needs through clinical scientific labels naturally triggers a deep fear of institutional judgment. The sender feels exposed in front of an unfeeling audience. The specific risk here is that a dyspraxic institution will weaponize this data. They can point to the charts and dismiss a profound, soul-deep love as a base, typical animal instinct. This exposure leads directly into friction point B, biological determinism and the pain of lost control. We can map these costs directly onto the translation system. As data exits the AI compiler, friction A and friction B warning tags attach to the stream. The data stream is now locked into a single deterministic trajectory. There is no room for human variance. By admitting that their devotion is a neurologically automated certainty, the sender is forced to completely surrender the illusion of free will. They must acknowledge that their brain mathematically demands the receiver's presence for survival. Confessing this biological necessity leaves the sender entirely exposed. The very act of proving absolute loyalty through science systematically strips the sender of their autonomy. The result is a profound, isolating humiliation. But the sender's psychology is only half of the problem. We have to examine the actual output generated by the AI compiler. This introduces friction point C, the strict limitation of cold facts. Numbers and charts are indifferent. They cannot compute personal hopes, painful life stories, or the lived experience of emotional suffering. Look at the data loss at the end of the translation pathway. As the metadata stream exits the compiler, it is rendered purely as rigid bar charts. Complex packets of human depth attempt to attach, but the clinical architecture actively filters them out. This data loss is the root cause of the sender's insecurity. It creates a terrifying doubt that despite their immense vulnerability, the attempt is failing to convey the truth. Sterile neurobiological data lacks the bandwidth required to convey the sheer, agonizing magnitude of the sender's devotion. The mathematical reality of scientific representation guarantees it will successfully transmit the raw fact of devotion, while simultaneously erasing the actual human experience of it. If this one-way transmission continues without physical validation, it becomes a relentless, isolated repetition, a mathematically predictable reaction. We can model this using a historical framework, the fate of Augustine of Hippo, who was isolated by an external siege. Augustine was left to ping-pong his perfectly mapped theoretical architecture against his bedroom wall in total isolation. Our flowchart shows the mechanism of failure. The data stream hits a solid barrier and bounces backward, with no return signal. The bouncing stream multiplies, accumulating intense heat and friction, pushing the system toward thermodynamic burnout. This isolation forces the sender to starve. Without the physical execution required to keep their truth alive, the theoretical structure collapses on itself. The subjective humiliation of the cringe functions as an indicator of objective system degradation, caused by the fractured feedback loop. This reframes the sender's embarrassment. It is not a failure of character, but the heavy, calculated cost of using science to defend a soul. To prevent system failure, the architecture requires an ultimate structural resolution, the earth element. Physical proximity and consummation operate as critical mathematical requirements to halt the impending thermodynamic burnout. Physical execution acts as the necessary catalyst. It is the only mechanism capable of collapsing those clinical cold facts back into a warm, validated human reality. Watch the system's resolution. The barrier dissolves, and sterile, linear elements transform into a cohesive, closed feedback loop. A continuous return signal flows from the apex node, cooling the system and absorbing all error warnings. This is the grounding power of a shared physical reality. It is the definitive catalyst required to complete the circuit and stabilize the entire structure. The physical return volley is an absolute requirement. It is the only way to prove the sender's intense biological vulnerability is successfully seen, processed, and accepted by the intellect they built it for.